Is this 3.5 liter EcoBoost engine in this F-150 actually more fuel efficient than the 5 liter Coyote V8 engine? Well, today we're gonna find out. Welcome back to the channel, guys. Last week we had the 5 liter Coyote V8 engine. We're doing a little fuel economy run just to see where it was at. And this week we have the notorious 3.5 liter EcoBoost engine as a direct comparison. We're gonna see how those two engines stack up in the real world when it comes to fuel economy. On paper, this thing should get 24 miles to the gallon, which is 2 miles per gallon better than the 5 liter, so we'll see what happens. I'm also going to tell you guys in terms of mechanical reasons as to why this engine should be more fuel efficient on paper, at least. The last time we had this EcoBoost on the channel, we were towing 8,000 pounds, and this thing's a great towing engine. But when it comes to fuel economy, oh boy, this thing was not efficient at all. In fact, this is the least efficient engine I've ever towed with. And the 5 liter blew this thing out of the water in terms of fuel economy. You guys said when these trucks are unloaded, the 3.5 liter EcoBoost will actually be way more efficient than the 5 liter. So we're here today to test those out. All right, so just like the 5 liter, we're set at 110 kilometers an hour. Cruise control is set. We are in eco mode. So we're just gonna let the truck do its thing and hopefully bring us the most fuel efficient run it can. We'll be referencing what the truck has to say, but obviously we'll do the math at the end, the real fuel economy based on how many liters of fuel we burnt. And it's always fun to see if the computer in the truck is somewhat accurate or kind of pulling our leg a little bit, not really giving the full story. Now, the first major advantage this engine has, and maybe the most obvious, is the displacement size. This thing is 3.5 liters of displacement, whereas the 5 liter, well, it's 5 liters of displacement. So strictly on paper, the displacement alone should be the biggest differentiating factor on this run. And I know some of you guys are screaming at the screen right now, Alex, this is a twin turbo setup, and yes, it is. We will cross that bridge together just in a second. So when this engine does not need to spool up those turbos, the lack of displacement this engine has should, on paper, in theory, lead to better fuel economy. Now, thankfully, we don't live in a world on paper. We live in the real world where there's hills, like the one just ahead of us, as well as wind and weight of a vehicle, all of which we'll get into later in the video as to why these turbos may affect the fuel economy. Now, we are 33 kilometers into our trek here, and we are at 14.5 liters per 100 kilometers, which is really not great. The 5 liter was actually much lower than this already. Currently, we're sitting at 12.2 liters per 100 kilometers, which is pretty decent. We'll see if this EcoBoost can really get that 24 miles to the gallon on the highway. I have my doubts right now. So behind me, we have a 2021 F-150 with the 3.5 liter EcoBoost. Obviously, critically, it has the exact same driveline as that 5 liter F-150 we drove last week. 10-speed transmission, as well as 331 gears in the back here, setting up for a very, very good fuel economy head-to-head test, because basically these trucks are almost identical. So hopefully it'll just all fall down to the different engines. And speaking of drivelines, it's another reason why this EcoBoost is going to be such an efficient engine. Obviously, comparing to the 5 liter, it's a very moot point because, well, they're the same drivelines. But when comparing to different manufacturers, this driveline is going to be highly advantageous in terms of fuel economy. This truck comes with a triple overdrive 10-speed transmission, meaning that when you're in 10th gear, the gear ratio is 0.63 to 1, which is a very deep overdrive gear, resulting in your RPMs at the speed we were going, at least 110, 70 mile an hour, right around 1500 RPM, which is, the engine's barely turning over, saving you fuel there. Now, the third trick up this engine sleeve when it comes to fuel economy is cam phasers. Yes, I know that's a little bit of a naughty word when it comes to this 3.5 liter EcoBoost because, well, they have so many issues with them, seemingly much more than the 5 liter Coyote V8. Long story short, basically what happens is the lockout pins fail on these cam phasers. So on startup, they kind of rattle around until there's oil pressure to control them. Good news is that once there's oil pressure, these cam phasers seem to run just fine, even if they have failed. This is what a cam phaser that's broken sounds like. Yep. And once you get oil pressure, it goes away. So that's my Park Guy Scotty's first gen EcoBoost. It's got over 400,000 kilometers on it. He said that phaser failed right around 60,000 kilometers. So he's been driving it for over 300,000 kilometers with a failed cam phaser. So this engine is a dual overhead cam setup, meaning you have 4 camshafts, meaning you're gonna have 4 cam phasers. And at the heart of it, it's a relatively simple thing. Basically what the cam phasers do is they shift the camshaft to adjust the timing of the engine to give you a more advantageous driving experience depending on what you're looking for. So they can obviously advance the timing, and that's what we're looking for today because that is going to help save fuel. It's gonna be much more economical. And then if you need power, you're towing, they're gonna shift the cam phasers to retard the engine timing. That's gonna, again, give you more power, more torque out of this engine. So in a nutshell, that is what the cam phasers do. For what we're doing today, looking for fuel economy, having those cam phasers is going to be beneficial. So the biggest difference between the 5 liter and this engine is, well, the twin turbo setup under the hood here. And it seems like people either love it or they hate the idea of having a turbo on their engine. Everyone likes to think that turbos are very efficient, but in fact, when they're feeding boost into an engine, they're actually very inefficient. I found this out very quickly when I was towing 8,000 pounds down this exact highway. Our fuel economy rating was the highest among any truck, any 1500 truck I've towed with. Even the 6.2 liter V8 engine from GM was more fuel efficient than this 3.5 liter EcoBoost when towing 8,000 pounds, which is something I never expected to see. To put it simply, when this 3.5 liter V6 engine requires more power than strictly the displacement can output, the turbos will spool up, force air into the cylinders, and as we mentioned earlier, gasoline engines require a very specific fuel-air mixture, and when you're shoving more air into those cylinders, a lot more air, it has to be met with what? A lot more fuel. So yes, this engine can produce a ton of power, and we saw that when I was towing with this engine, this thing was an incredibly powerful engine when towing. It towed phenomenally, tons of performance, but with that performance comes very poor fuel economy. And obviously today we are not towing, but what we are facing, as you guys can maybe see in the background there, is this is a very hilly area, which means when we're in a 5,000 pound pickup truck, maybe even going into some headwind, those turbos are going to be spooling up and forcing more air into the engine, resulting in what? More fuel getting used in order to create the power the engine needs. And while we can see, we're at 14.2 liters per 100 kilometers, which is quite a bit more than what the 5 liter was at. Now, in my opinion, the reason why people associate turbos with being fuel efficient is because, well, having turbos like an engine like this, you can get away with having a smaller displacement engine, yet still having all that power when you need it. For example, if we were going, I don't know, 30, 35 mile an hour on flat ground, this engine would be wildly efficient because it wouldn't need to use the turbos. You just have that 3.5 liters of displacement sucking fuel back, which is not that bad in comparison to a big V8. So that's typically why turbocharged engines are more efficient, because you can just have a smaller displacement engine, and when the conditions are advantageous, that engine can be very efficient. Now, lastly, one fuel economy hack this engine does not have is cylinder deactivation, and quite frankly, I really like that. I think it is pretty well known. Cylinder deactivation is highly correlated with lifter failures in the GM trucks and potentially in the Hemi trucks as well. So Actually quite like that about this engine, despite maybe losing a little bit of fuel economy. So we're coming to the end of our fuel economy run here, and we're at 13.2 liters per 100 kilometers. Personally, I was expecting these engines to actually be like very close, and this one to be maybe a little bit more efficient, but as of right now, at least according to the truck, we are 2 liters per 100 kilometers less efficient, which is something I didn't see coming. But we'll fill this thing up, and then we'll get back to the shop and we'll crunch the numbers and do the actual math before we come to any real conclusions. Well, we made her back to the shop. As you guys can remember, the computer in this truck told us we had a fuel economy rating of 13.2 liters per 100 kilometers. I'll put the miles per gallon down on the screen. Went to the gas station, filled this thing up. 12.3 liters of fuel was put into this to top it up, giving us a calculated value of 13.5 liters per 100 kilometers. That is over 3 miles per gallon less efficient than the 5 liter doing the exact same route. Now, this is the real world. We could have been facing a stronger headwind today. The temperature is a little bit cooler. We're about -5, -6 today. When we ran the 5 liter, we were about 5 or 6 degrees above freezing. So that definitely could have had an impact. The other thing is the tires on this truck. I was thinking about it when I was driving. There's some all-terrain tires on this truck. That is going to affect fuel economy, but I mean, you know, over 3 miles per gallon difference is a big gap. And I don't think tires and temperature alone are going to have that big of an impact. So I'm definitely curious, if you guys own one of these Ecoboost engines, what you guys are getting for fuel economy on the highway, because again, 17.4 miles per gallon seems quite a bit high. Yeah, I'm honestly a little bit shocked at the fuel economy on the highway. I thought it was gonna be much, much better, but it's the real world, and it's just, these things happen. As always, guys, if you liked the video, don't forget to leave that thumbs up. And if you like cool stuff like this, I'm gonna head home. I'm gonna go drink a beer, most likely, and we'll see you in the next freaking video, guys.